Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and wherever you might be in the world. Our online series of talks and conversations continues with our guest Maya Arad, and I'll introduce Maya to you in just a moment after some brief housekeeping. Please do ask questions. To do this, you can type whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen, and as ever, we'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as possible. There's also a chat facility you'll find on your screen, and you can use this to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, we are recording this event. It will appear in the next day or two on the Milim website at milim.org.uk. There you'll find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Maya Arad is the author of 12 books of Hebrew fiction, as well as studies in literary criticism and linguistics. Born in Israel, she received a PhD in linguistics from University College London, and for the last 20 years has lived in California, where she is writer in residence for the Tauber Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford University. Known as the foremost Hebrew writer outside of Israel, this book, The Hebrew Teacher, is the first of her works to be translated into English, and that is primarily what we'll be discussing this evening. So a big warm welcome to you, Maya. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So how have we got to this point? You've been in California for 20 years, which is pretty much your entire writing career, and yet nothing's been published in English up to this point. Was that intentional?
No, not at all. Actually, I had a dear neighbor who recently passed away at the age of 97, and every time I ran into her, she would say, "I want to read you before I die." And at some point I told her, I think the best way would be for you to learn Hebrew, because it wasn't happening. So I don't know why it took so long. I know that, the odds are against all books in translation. I think only between 2 or 3% of the books that appear in America per year are a translation from any language. So it's really, really difficult. And, the book market is also very difficult right now. So it just wasn't happening. And I should say that because I don't live in Israel, I'm not eligible for any of the translation grants that the Ministry of Culture and Education sometimes gives to writers to get their books translated. So somehow things didn't happen. And actually, I owe it to my colleague at Stanford, Vered Shemtov, who a few years ago, she had some money left over at the Hebrew program, the kind of money you can't roll over for the next year. And she said, let's get one of your novellas translated. How about The Hebrew Teacher? I could use it in my classrooms, and maybe we could place an excerpt online. And luckily, Jessica Cohen, who translated this book, had some time for us, and she translated beautifully this novella. And then Michael Wise from New Vessel Press came across it, and it was also he had something long enough to get to know my work, and also it's a book of 3 novellas, so 1/3 was already translated. So that's how we got this book translated and published in the US.
So we'll talk a bit more about the translation and the mechanics of it a little bit later, hopefully. What can you tell us about this book in sort of 30 seconds, if you were, your elevator pitch for it, perhaps?
Right. So The Hebrew Teacher is a collection of 3 novellas that have a common theme running across them, Israeli women and immigration. It has 2 older women, one a middle-aged woman, 2 women who immigrated, and 1 woman whose only son moved to America and she was left behind, and 2 women who, are in California and 1 in the Midwest. So it's like 2, 2, and 1. And each of them, is facing some kind of crisis or difficulty after having immigrated. Ilana, the Hebrew teacher from the titular novella, is having a professional crisis, defending her life's work. In the final novella, Make New Friends, Efrat, who is an immigrant mother, is having a hard time, helping her daughter adjust to American middle school. So it's about, immigration and parenting. And in the second novella, a grandmother is coming to visit her grandson for the first time after not having seen her son for a very long time. And again, coming to terms with the distance that immigration creates within families.
Now, we were just chatting before we started the webinar, and you were interested to know how many of the audience would have read the book. And interestingly, we've just had a note put on the chat that this book was chosen for a book club in Leeds. So I imagine quite a few of the audience have read it. The writer of this question is interested to know how you work with the translator. It was also a question I was intending to ask. Did you leave things entirely to Jessica Cohen, or were you closely involved in the process? And then we have the question, do you see the original as a separate entity from the translation?
Right. So Jessica Cohen and I have been friends long before she translated this book, and it was a dream come true. We were hoping to work together for a very long time. And because I live in America and of course, I'm not able to write in English, but I know enough to read the translation, I was very involved. And this was part of the joy of working with Jessica because, it was so much fun just working together and discussing. And Jessica is a wonderful translator. A while ago, I was talking to my mother. Jessica just finished translating another book that I wrote. And my mother asked, what are you working on now? And I said, I'm going over Jessica's translation. And my mother said, with all due respect, who are you to go over Jessica's English? And I said, Mom, I'm not going over her English. I'm advocating for my Hebrew. So this is how I see my role as working with the translator. The translator produces the best English version possible, and I'm there to advocate for my Hebrew. I can give you one example of this.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, in the first novella, Ilana, the Hebrew teacher, has a professional clash with a new hire, a very young and arrogant man called Yoad Bergman Harari. And it says there in Hebrew that Yoad was the chosen candidate over, out of the three. Now, in Hebrew, every noun and every adjective have a gender on them. So if we say candidate, we know if it's male or female. And I told Jessica, we're losing something from the Hebrew because when you read the Hebrew, you realize that, the two other candidates were females. So, this arrogant man was selected over them. And we lose this in English. So she changed it. She made it clear that the two other candidates were women somehow, either by including their name or using the pronoun she. And this is the kind of things that we're doing there. Other things, involve cultural differences because, the Hebrew version was full of references that every Hebrew speaker knows. And it's a very good question what we're doing with this in English. So in the third novella, Make New Friends, there's a teenage girl in middle school, and she's the only one at school who doesn't have a smartphone. And her parents don't want to give her one because they think that, it will expose her to all sorts of things. And at some point, a friend of the mother tells her you have to give her a phone or she'll be completely isolated. And she says in the Hebrew version, if you want a child without a smartphone, go raise her in Mea Shearim. Mea Shearim is an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem where nobody uses smartphones. And this is something that I learned during the translation process about English. Because if this were a translation into Hebrew or into Russian or into French, there would be a footnote. And, the translator would explain what's Mea Shearim. But apparently English doesn't work like that. Jessica explained to me that it's a failure of the translator if you need to use footnotes. That's the convention, at least for fiction books. I don't know about nonfiction. So instead, she just wrote, if you want a child without a smartphone, go join an ultra-Orthodox sect.
I suppose it depends who your audience is going to be for the book. I would imagine pretty much any Jewish reader would know what Mea Shearim where Mea Shearim is, because it's, it's something people visit or at least know about
Right,
in Jerusalem. But
right,
if you, I suppose, if you're looking for a wider audience, then yes, you're absolutely right. They wouldn't know.
right. And I think for the work of translation, we need to target the widest audience possible, right?
Yes,
We're not really writing. I
absolutely.
think it's the same also, when you write a book in your own language right? You want to reach the widest audience. You don't want to write just for your
Yeah,
narrow
absolutely,
circle. Yeah.
absolutely. So
Now,
yeah,
about the other question was whether the Hebrew is a separate
whether you see it
entity.
as a separate entity, yes.
It's really interesting. Yes and no.
In
So
which
it is
way?
separate, yes, because I was going to say that the Hebrew version is, something that, my own work, and the English is a collaboration, but it wouldn't be precise because I have a wonderful editor for Hebrew. His name is Eli Hirsch, and he translated all my books except for the two novels in verse that I wrote. So it's also a collaboration with my editor. So actually, um,
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. What is the process of editing? How many iterations does the book go through? How changed is it at the finish of the process to the manuscript you started with?
right. So you mentioned that I wrote 12 books, and each of them
Mm.
was a different story.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
So I had books that were hardly ever edited, no, very lightly edited, and then they went to press. Unfortunately, that's the exception. And I had one book that I wrote, 100,000 words. And after discussing it with my editor, we realized that I have to throw this version away and rewrite the whole thing. So it's really, really different. Every time I start a new book, it's a new process. I don't know how it will work. I pray that it will be, light and easy, but it's not always the case. But normally what happens is that I write a first draft, I put it aside, I wait a little, I go over it, and after going over it, I show it to my editor, Eli Hirsch. And Eli likes to read every book twice. First, he gives like very general advice, about, he calls it the macro, plot, directions, things like that. And after I rewrite it according to, we discuss what I want to accept, what I don't, what I insist on, what he thinks is essential. I rewrite it, and then he goes over the whole thing and we look at it. And I always thought that everyone works like me, but Eli says that I'm his only author who puts in the hardest work after he's done editing. Because after he's done editing, I finally see all now I have a clear version and I can see all the
Mm.
problems that I couldn't see before. So normally after Eli is done editing, I go through the whole thing one more time
So
or
you so,
twice.
so you get the last word. I would imagine many authors are probably they feel they've done their work by that point. So it's real
Right.
dedication they
No, I
put
really
in.
feel that, there were hidden problems that I couldn't see before. And after the editing, the whole manuscript is clearer, so I can see what's going
Fascinating.
on.
So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit more about you, and then we'll get into these novellas in a bit more detail. Have you always wanted to be a writer? Was this an ambition from a young age, or is it something that came to you later on?
It was an ambition from young age, and I was writing a lot. And then I think at some point during my late adolescence, I realized that, writing is not a career, and I should think in a more practical way. So since I loved languages, I thought I would become a linguist. And I got a BA from Tel Aviv University and then a PhD from University College London. And I taught for a few years and I had a few postdocs, but the academic career wasn't happening as planned, and I did not get a job. And uh, at the same time, I was working on my first book, which was a novel in verse, Another Place, a Foreign City. Probably, one thing depends on the other. I was putting most of my time and effort into my novel in verse because that's where my passion was, and not into linguistics. And but yes, only after Plan B didn't work, I went back to Plan A and I became a writer.
And in terms of finding your voice as a writer, how did that come?
I'm still looking for it. Every book,
Very good.
every book I write, I'm no, it's true. I tried many different genres and many different usually, again, I always it's always strange to find out that I'm different from other writers because when I speak to other writers, many of them say, I was thinking about this character and I really wanted to write about this character. And for me, very often, what I have in mind is a book. I want to write a book with this plot.
Mm.
I want to write a book about that, and that's how I work. As I mentioned before, my first book that was published was a novel in verse, and this was a very good exercise in finding my voice because it was a novel in verse in the same meter that Pushkin wrote Eugene Onegin. And
Mm.
later on, Vikram Seth wrote The Golden Gate. Actually, I
Yeah,
came across
yeah.
The Golden Gate by Vikram Seth when I was a graduate student in England. And I remember thinking, wow, if Seth
It's
could do this,
ambitious, isn't it?
yeah,
It's
if he could
ambitious.
do this for
Yeah,
English,
yeah.
maybe I can do this for Hebrew.
Mm.
And it was very ambitious. My husband made fun of me. Now he cannot make fun of me anymore. If I say I want to
Mm.
write something completely crazy, he believes me that I'm going to do it because I did a
It's a
novel
long
in
time
verse.
since I read The Golden Gate, but what I remember of it is you are not mindful you're reading verse if as you
Right,
get
it's
into
very
it. Yeah,
flowing, and
yeah,
the novel is there. There's a plot. It's a novel. It's not really
mm.
poetry, right?
Yeah. It's
It's
brilliant.
just in
It's
verse.
brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's what I was hoping to do. And I learned Russian in the process, so I can read Pushkin. And I was very curious to see, how this meter would work for Hebrew. And I can say now that it works better for Hebrew than for English. Something about the structure of the language, the morphology works
Mm.
better, closer to Russian.
Interesting. And I imagine
Yeah.
it would be rather difficult to translate it into English.
Impossible. Yeah.
So people wanting to experience that will need to learn Hebrew, which brings us nicely to the Hebrew teacher, which is the first of the three novellas. And as you say, there is a lecturer, a university lecturer, who is having a professional crisis. This fellow comes to her department and um, sort of upends her cozy 40-year career. And the opening and closing of this first novella speak about Hebrew and the words. It's not being a good time for Hebrew. Um, I I wondered because sort of reading your biography, there's a lot about the character of Ilana that seems to mirror things that you've done or elements of your life. To what extent is this character autobiographical? And do you feel it's not a good time for Hebrew?
Right. So it's really very interesting because I said before that as a writer, I normally start with a plot or, I want to write a book, but the novella, The Hebrew Teacher, is really different because in this case, I really had, the character of Ilana appear before me and I wanted to write about her. And I think if you look superficially, there isn't much that Ilana and I share because, she's about a generation older than me. She belongs to a different group of Israeli immigrants, those that, who came to America at a time when immigration out of Israel was really frowned upon. She's the only one in this book who lives with some guilt about not living in Israel. And she lives in a place where there's a very small Israeli community. I live in Silicon Valley, where we have tens of thousands of Israelis.
Mm.
So she lives here within a Jewish community. I live pretty much within the Israeli community of Silicon Valley.
Mm.
She's married to an American Jew, and she belongs to a synagogue. I haven't been to a synagogue. I mean, now I'm visiting synagogues for book clubs, but before that, I think the last time was my cousin's Bnei Mitzvah somewhere in the 1980s. So. And my husband is Israeli. I speak Hebrew at home with my husband and children, and that's a very big difference from Ilana too.
Mm.
And of course, she's in the Midwest. But after all, you take away all those, differences. At the very core, we're both Israeli women living in America and making some sort of living off Hebrew. And as the book says, it's not a very good time for Hebrew. So yes, this is the place I think where I can relate to Ilana viscerally. Now, before we talk about whether it's a good time for Hebrew or not, No, it's not a good time in general. It's not a good time for humanities in America, at least. There's a point in the book where Ilana's chair, because even before Yoad comes to college, Ilana's world is becoming to unravel, right? The enrollment for her classes are really low. So Ilana's chair asks, "What's going on with enrollment?" And she says, "Well, it's it's like this everywhere. It's the same in Italian and in Russian, and so I think, this is where, as someone who, as a literature person, as a person who studied the humanities, I see this all over the place. The humanities are in trouble. And I think it's particularly obvious at a place like Stanford, which is, a private university that's very much leans towards the technology and engineering. And, when you're in the humanities, you feel you're like, um, left behind. So this is somewhere that, I had in mind when I wrote the novella. Now, yeah, I mean, having said all that, it's not a great time for Hebrew either. But neither Ilana nor I, we're not going to give up. Ilana will teach until the last moment she can teach, and I will keep on writing. It's
But there's a lot in her life about posturing and impressing the right people. There's a whole sort of theatre of who you need on side and all. I mean, is that real? Is that what's happening, or what happens in the world of academia? Is it really that petty, or is this something you've sort of concocted for the character in the book?
It really is this petty, not necessarily, not for me. I was very, very lucky, and not for, people around me, but I've heard stories, I've seen things, and yes, and I think, um, it's very tempting to read this story as a story about generation gap and about different politics of Yoad and Ilana. But at the very core, Ilana is a lecturer or an adjunct, right? And Yoad is a tenure track faculty, is about to get tenure, even gets tenure at the end of the story. And the power struggle between, a tenure track academic star, who is a young man, and an older woman who is an adjunct. I mean, that's the core of
Mm,
the novella. And Yoad is fully aware of this power dynamics, and he's using it for his own, benefit. And sadly, the only person who is not aware of this is Ilana. She thinks because she's so hardworking and she's been there for 40 years, she's indispensable. And unfortunately, she's not.
mm. Um, the book in Hebrew was published about 7 years ago, and the English version, was it just post October the 7th or just before, but sort of around
Shortly
that
after,
time,
yeah.
shortly
Mhm.
after.
Mhm.
Um, so how has the English translation been received compared to the Hebrew? And has your experience at Stanford been impacted at all by the events of October the 7th?
So I'll start with the second part of the question.
Yeah,
So luckily, I'm affiliated with the Center for Jewish Studies.
right.
And my husband is in classics where people are more sensible. So we feel very, supported by administration and sheltered. But my colleagues in comparative literature and education and other fields have very different stories. I felt, post October 7, most strongly as a mother because I have a daughter who goes to art school in New York, to Cooper Union, and she had a very hard time. She was being bullied by her friends for, I grew up in Kibbutz Nachal Oz, less than a mile from Gaza, one of the kibbutzim that were attacked. And she did some art, based on my childhood pictures from the kibbutz to commemorate, those who died. And this was reason enough, for her classmates to feel that she's a settler colonialist. And
Unbelievable.
we've been through this last year, but
Yeah.
now things are quieter there, fortunately. So, I experienced um, the events of happening on college campuses, but as a mother, not,
Mm. And in
myself.
terms of the book itself, has that been sort of interpreted as having any sort of I don't know, subliminal messages about Israelis or Israeli society, or is it being received just a piece of writing in its own right.
Right. So obviously, when October 7 happened, the book was in production. And my first thought was, wow, now the book will be completely irrelevant because,
Mm.
when they speak about the war in Gaza, in the first novella, The
Yeah.
Hebrew Teacher, those words have taken on a horrific new meaning. How will it ever be relevant? And
Mm.
curiously, the opposite happened because people thought that the character of Yoad is so relevant to,
Mm.
what's happening today, the way people treat Israel and criticize it so harshly. So
Mm.
some people even thought it was prescient in the way that, characters like Yoad showed up everywhere. Um,
So there's this huge tension between Ilana and Yoad, and indeed there are tensions in the other novellas which we'll hopefully talk about. But does she win or does she lose? I mean, she loses a battle with Yoad, but she gains something she didn't have before. There's a question actually from Barbara Levy, who's from the Sinai Readers Book Club, who read the book. Um, they wonder whether she was the architect of her own misfortune, and could she have taken another path to stop being overlooked by the male character?
that's a great question. When I was working on this story, I knew that, it wouldn't be a good story if it were black and white, right? Ilana
Yeah.
is all good and Yoad is the bad guy. And in fact, there's a lot in Yoad that I can relate to. I also lived on both coasts, the East Coast and the West Coast of America. And if I were thrown by myself into a small college town in the Midwest, I think I would have a hard time adjusting. And
Mm.
so I really think it takes two to tango. And, although Yoad is vicious because of the way he treats Ilana,
Mm.
but Ilana can be, she can be pretty annoying. The way she lectures to Yoad, the way she tries to educate him, to show him how things work, to tell him what he's supposed to do or not supposed to do. I can definitely see how she rubs him the wrong way and why he's so mad at her and why, he's doing
Mm.
all he can to get rid of her. So yes, I think if Ilana had more, self-awareness, if she understood that, other people can have different opinions and that, maybe she comes across as too pushy or something like that, this train wreck could have been avoided. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. And yet, after all of this, when she decides to write, she's decided to write in English. Um, is this, I don't know, vicarious wishing on your part, or she's not like you? You don't write in
No,
English.
no. So I don't write in English, and actually, I think that b- both in the Hebrew version and both in the translation, I think the moment Ilana decides to write in English is the moment when we actually realize that her children cannot read Hebrew. So she was a Hebrew teacher for over 40 years, but her children cannot read Hebrew.
Mm. Which is
And
the
that,
generation gap you're
yes, yes. So
exposing.
that's a
Yeah.
sad point, when she realizes that. And I sometimes think about it because, my older daughter, I read it out loud to her, the book. She's fluent in Hebrew, but she's not reading
Mm.
very fast. So I read it out loud to her in Hebrew, and she enjoyed it. But, she read the book cover to cover only when it appeared in English.
In English, yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, my parents can read my books. I once heard a writer, a Hebrew writer who writes in English because there are a few writers who did made this move and
Mm.
turned to write in English. And she said her own mother cannot read her books until they're translated. So it's really, it's again a generational thing, right? I'm siding with my parents' generation. No, I feel very lucky, to write in Hebrew. I love this language, and to publish in Israel.
Mm.
If we're bringing up this subject, it's not something that I take for granted that, Israeli audiences in Israel are willing to read books by writers who don't live in Israel. And not only that, but books that deal with the Israeli expats. Because for many years, this topic was not part of Hebrew literature. Hebrew literature was confined to the geographical borders of the state of Israel. And it's a recent
Yeah,
thing that people are willing to read about that.
that's interesting. Do you think
Mhm.
that's because people are more outward looking, or they are just generally more open?
I think it's two things. First, yes, times have changed, and the process of Yerida as opposed to Aliyah, the state of leaving Israel, has been destigmatized,
Mm.
unlike in the 1970s and 1980s. And the other part of this process is that many Israelis, spend some time abroad. Either they move somewhere else, or they just spend a few years working or going to school somewhere else. And it has become a very central experience for Israelis, and they want to read about it. When
Mm.
I wrote an academic novel about, American graduate school with a few graduates, people felt, oh, finally, there's a book about my life. I
Yeah,
want to read it.
interesting.
Yeah.
So we move on to the second novella.
Mhm.
We have Miriam. She's Israeli. She's visiting her son and his family in California, and there's a tension again with Maya, the daughter-in-law. Um, and as with the first novella, you really feel the tension. I mean, these are books which are not they're enjoyable to read, but they're not a joy to read. You feel the pain of the protagonists when you read these books, definitely. And then the cracks appear, and we realize that the perfect lives are not so perfect. What are you trying to say here?
Right. So first of all, let me just go back to something you said about you said that Miriam is the grandmother and she's visiting, and there are tensions with her daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
And I
Well,
find
and
it
her
very,
son, yeah.
yeah. So
Okay.
I find it very interesting that people, pick on the poor daughter-in-law. No,
Because she
of
has
course,
no interaction with the son. The son is absent. All of the
precisely.
all of
So
all of the dialogue is with the daughter-in-law, I suppose. So it's an easy
yeah.
trap to fall into, and I fell in. Yeah.
So the daughter-in-law is working on her PhD, right? So she's working from home. She's done with her classes. So she's the one who's home with the grandmother all day.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. The son is at work all day, and actually, it's hinted that he's trying to even stay late just to avoid his mother. So I think the story is primarily about the estrangement between the mother and the son, and the daughter-in-law
Mm.
is just, stuck in between, poor thing.
Mm.
So I just maybe because I was a daughter-in-law too. And I haven't
Mm.
been a mother-in-law yet, so I seem to sympathize with the daughter-in-law, but I really feel that people are being very harsh on her when she's
Mm.
just, stuck there. And it's true, you're right. So Maya, by the way, her name, people ask me, why did you pick your name for the
Mm.
daughter-in-law? In Hebrew, it's spelled differently. I really feel it's a
Okay.
different name.
Yeah.
And I just thought it worked fine. So she's not mean. She's just very cold and not very forthcoming, right? And she's trying to work on her thesis while Miriam has all sort of questions to her. I think again, like in the story with Ilana and Yoad, it's not black and white, right? So of
Mm.
course Maya is not perfect, but Miriam can also be quite annoying, especially when she tells Maya things about her toddler son. Why doesn't he talk? Yoram
Mm.
could speak whole sentences when he was his age. So I
Yeah.
don't think any mother likes to hear these kind of things. Mm.
True, but then you've got these sort of cracks that appear, and the same in the third novella. The sort of perfect lives suddenly are not so perfect, and we realize that these people who are um, externally seen as popular or successful or whatever winners actually have some serious defects and problems of their own. Um, is that something you've observed? Is that something you wish to draw people's attention to? Are you saying don't judge a book by its cover? I mean, it's interesting.
Right.
You pick up on
Yeah, yeah. I'm not really when I read a book, I'm not I really want to enjoy good literature, good writing, a good plot, good descriptions. I'm not looking for hidden messages or anything like that. So I'm not even
that.
trying to incorporate this into my writing. I think in the second story, if you ask what were you trying to show, I try to show most of all that the situation of, living far from Israel and having your relatives visit you is a difficult situation. And no matter, even if you love your family, right? Just having someone who stays there and observes you 24/7 can be quite hard.
Mm.
So I think that's the situation that I wanted to show, and many people told me that they could relate, that that's how they feel when their family come to visit, even if they love, their parents and siblings when they visit. So it was really, and of course, when you want to write a story, you take an extreme case. I had a friend who asked me, but why do you write about people like this? And I said, because
Mm.
they make the best stories, right? I mean, if I wrote about the other mother-in-law, daughter-in-law pair that appear as sidekicks in the story, Malka and Ravit, who are, a couple of lovebirds and they do everything together and they go shopping together and they love each other, it wouldn't make a good story.
Yeah, it's a theme. I've certainly seen in other Hebrew literature in translation of the relative that visits and this distance. It's this sort of chasm. It's obviously something that plays on the minds of people in that situation. But I was interested, certainly the second novella, you write it in the manner of a diary, and each sort of chapter, as it were, they're fairly short chapters, actually makes it really easy to read, because you can read for a minute or you can read for an hour, but you're always going to find a point to a suitable point to stop. But you gradually reveal more information about the character and the story, as you go along. And I wondered, to what extent is that something that's meticulously planned, or is it something that just happens as you're writing? So when we had Dror Mishani on a couple of years ago, he told us that he plans the structure of his novels in huge detail and then writes them. And I've had other writers who say, no, I just sit down and write, and it happens. So which camp are you in?
I'm definitely Camp Mishani. Now, Dror, of
Mm.
course, is a detective novelist, right? So he
Yeah.
really has to plan it very carefully, right? For everything works into place. So I'm Camp Dror, and the more experience I have writing, I find that I have to plan more. So I think my two or three most recent books, I didn't only just write down the ideas, and a synopsis, but I really, I wrote a little summary of what's happening in every chapter of the book. Otherwise, I just felt that I will get to this point where I don't want to be, which I mentioned before, that I had a whole draft and I had to throw it away because it didn't work. So I'm trying to plan very carefully. And I also came across writers who told me, oh no, when I start writing, I don't know anything. And, the characters just, drag me by the sleeve and show me the way. And I find it hard to believe them.
Well, I'm sure it's planned in their mind,
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
if
No,
not on
so
paper.
I'm a planner, yeah. And
Good.
normally I have, about I need to know at least two-thirds of the plot.
Yeah.
And one-third, I discover as I go along. And I always know, where I start and where I want to get. I don't always know what the way would be like. It's like driving in the dark, right? And the lights of your car can only, reveal what, like 20, 30 meters ahead of you, and you have to keep
Yeah.
going to see what's ahead.
So you're saying you don't necessarily know what's going to happen at the end when you start writing, or you
I
do?
do actually I do know what I want
Yeah.
to happen in the end.
Yeah.
I don't know how I'm gonna get there.
Oh, I see. Okay. Because at the end of this novella, the second one, there is a reconciliation of sorts.
Uh-huh.
It's a happy ending, I suppose, if you like. Maybe not quite so happy because the poor guy's in hospital, but it's happier than the other ones.
But we
Here's
know
a,
it's gonna
yeah,
be okay. Yes.
we know
Mhm.
he's going to be okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, here's
Mhm.
a fascinating question from somebody watching. As you live in the USA and have been away for many years, how do you keep up with current language usage? Is your language in talking about Ilana, more old-fashioned than current Hebrew?
That's a
Wow.
great question. Yeah. So first of all, it's not for me to judge.
Mm,
But people, and the other half of this question is that, I think there's a point for Ilana, who has been outside Israel for 45 years, and she feels that her Hebrew is rusty, but her English is not good enough. And the only thing that has stayed with me from my time as a linguist is knowing that, we know our mother tongue in a way that we will never be able to acquire a second language. So, I better stick with my mother tongue. I better make sure that my Hebrew doesn't get rusty because there's no way to master English as my first language. So this is the lesson that, I learned and Ilana hasn't. So now I read a lot. I really read a lot of Hebrew books. I try to read almost every worthy Hebrew book that appears. And also, I've been living in America for 20 years, but I left Israel 31 years ago to
mm.
go to graduate school in England. So this was before internet, and I can see with my own eyes what difference this made because, now I can watch, whatever TV series that people in Israel watch. I can read the newspapers. It took me a long
Yeah.
time to explain to my father that there's no need to call me and tell me what's happening in Israel because I already read it when he was asleep. So because, we're
Yeah.
earlier
Yeah,
than
we
Israel.
watch the Israeli TV here too, so it's
Right. So
not just
this
yeah.
really, really helps.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about up-to-date language, I just recently came across a word that I didn't know. So I have two younger sisters in Israel. I asked them; they didn't know either. But my niece's boyfriend did. So, that's how
But
I
so you found
get
out
up
in
to
the end
date.
that
Yeah.
question about language was from Elsie Prince. She's also in the Sinai Readers Book Club. Now, the final story is this teenager, Libby, and her mother, Efrat. It's probably the most painful to read in terms of the disconnect between them, particularly as I have teenage children. You obviously have or had teenage children at one time. Um, and this game she plays, Efrat, pretending to be Libby online. This is a high stakes, dangerous game. Where's this from? Do you have an online presence? Do you have you ever done this? Have you ever snooped on your children's online presence?
So let me tell you how it all happened, actually.
Yeah.
So I think this story goes back to 2006. Where I came across an article in the New York Times, and it said it was an article about a teenage girl who committed suicide, and it turned out she committed suicide after being harassed online by a 16-year-old boy who told her, "You're a terrible person. You should kill yourself." And then there was a police investigation, and it turned out that it was not a teenage boy; it was a woman in her 40s who was pretending to be a teenage boy. And she did that because the girl that she tormented bullied her own daughter at school. And I remember, reading it and not being able to stop thinking about it. How come a seemingly normal person is doing anything like that? No, and I thought I need to write about this, but I couldn't because, I just couldn't understand how somebody does this. And if you can't understand them, you can't write about it. And I should mention that at the time I had, a 2-year-old girl. Years later, my daughter reached middle school, and I was, exposed firsthand to, the mean girls in middle school. And of course, I would never do anything like that, and I did not do anything like that, but I could understand, how someone is driven to in despair to do it, and I was able to write about it. So that's the answer to your question.
Um, we have another question from Jeanette Marks. Hasn't read your book, but she asks, do you have a particular audience in mind when you write? Do you consider yourself as a Jewish author?
Right. I definitely consider myself as a Jewish author, but the other day, last summer in at the farmers market, somebody was asking for Mexican corn, which is a, sweet type of corn. And the seller said, I'm Mexican and this is my corn. So here's Mexican corn. So I could say, I'm Jewish. This is my book. No, I'm a Jewish author. So I'm definitely a Jewish author. I'm also, but of course, this doesn't mean that I have to conform to a particular type of Judaism. I'm very secular, right? I grew up in Israel. So I feel very Jewish. I feel that I'm also, not perhaps the most prototypical author of what people think about when they think of Jewish authors, but I definitely see myself as a
You
Jewish
certainly
author.
explore this theme a little bit in the second novella, where Miriam wants to light candles on Friday night, and it's obviously
Right.
something that the son and the daughter-in-law have not done ever. They're almost bemused by it.
Right, right. And
Yeah,
also, in the first novella, Yoad is making a little face when
yes,
Ilana
yes,
is lighting candles and makes kiddush. Yes. So
yes.
I think this actually, and I haven't even, done it as to make a point or anything. It just
Mm,
represents the very, secular type of Jewishness that Israelis often have, right?
mm,
And and it's part of Judaism. That's how, at least that's how I explained it to my daughter, because when she was in kindergarten, a Jewish boy at her school asked her, how come you're Jewish if you eat bread on Passover? And
mm,
she came with the question to me. And I explained to her that, there are many types of Jews and there are secular Jews, and we're secular Jews. So,
mm. Yeah, interesting. Um, I suppose you're not the only Israeli author to explore this expat theme. It's I can think of at least two other writers I've spoken to over the years who've covered it too. Um, what's what's the attraction? Is it like the promised land for people who already live in the promised land? What's the draw? Is it that this is where people can make their fortunes? Why is it that Israelis want to go to America and California in particular?
wow. Well, are you asking me now when we both know what the situation in Israel is like?
Well, it certainly wasn't before.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's interesting. Yes, Silicon Valley has a particular attraction for Israelis. Many of
mm,
them work in tech, and many of them feel that this is the place where you can make a fortune, or you can really. So most people don't talk about making a fortune. They talk about maximizing their potential,
mm,
changing the field, fulfilling themselves. And it's true that when you open the Israeli newspapers, usually, what you see is the success stories
mm,
of those who really, made a fortune or changed the field. And for me, when I was writing about, the second novella, who is about Yoram, who is a man who
mm,
works in tech, it was very important for me to show the other side, right? Not
mm,
everybody made a fortune. Some people feel, eternally frustrated. I
mm,
personally know some people, some of them in their 50s and some in their late 70s, who came from Israel to Silicon Valley to seek their fortune, and it hasn't always worked. And
mm,
you have to live with this disappointment. I think this is the difference between newspapers and literature, right? Because literature
mm.
is more concerned with failures and frustrations, and
Yeah.
not with
I mean, with
success
Yoram,
necessarily.
it's even worse, isn't it? Because he did make it, and then he gambled a
Right,
lot and blew it.
right,
And that
right,
you
right.
you can feel
Yeah,
his pain. You really can.
yeah.
But in moving to Silicon Valley, is something lost? You said there are tens of thousands of Israelis in Silicon Valley, but religion is probably a casualty. But what about identity? What about connection? Is it the panacea, or are they really sacrificing something in going there?
Well, of course, I cannot speak in the name of 40 or 50,000 Israelis who
Yeah,
live in
yeah,
Silicon Valley, and really everyone is a different story.
yeah.
A tiny correction. I don't think religion is sacrificed because, as I said before, most
You
Israelis
don't think
grew
they're
up very
religious in the first
secular.
place?
And
Yeah.
if anything, many of them joined synagogues when they moved to America for the
Okay.
sake of identity. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so I can only speak, personally for me. And, I haven't moved to Silicon Valley to work in tech. I moved there because my husband got a job at Stanford University.
Mm.
So we're not really part of this. So for me, being far away from family is the hardest thing, and being far away from friends, and being far away from, where Hebrew literature is mostly, being written.
Mm.
It's very hard, and I try to visit as often as I can, and to be part of this literature. And I think, given the circumstances, I'm very happy with where I am,
Mm.
and I have no regrets. But of course, yes, you pay a price. You always pay a price. Mm.
So what is your relationship with Israel now? I mean, you say you visit frequently. It sounds like you're unlikely to return, or maybe you are. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we made a conscious choice to move to America or to stay outside Israel. My relation to Israel is simple. I love the country. I love the people. I hate the government. And I can share with you that Netanyahu was elected for the first time when I was a graduate student in London. And until then, it was very simple. We planned to finish graduate school and go back to Israel.
Mm.
And when Netanyahu was elected, I felt that something was broken because he was so instrumental in bringing about the assassination of Rabin with all of his incitement. And I just
Mm.
felt that if the people elected him, something is completely wrong, and we can't fix it anymore. And to be honest, I didn't think it would be, he would be that bad. He's even worse
Mm.
than I thought. But
Okay.
it's
Well,
very, very sad. Yes, it's.
nobody has nobody's posted anything in the comments yet, but I'm sure they might. Tell me something about
I'm honest.
the. No, I mean that's what we want. Um, I mean, I'm sure some people in this country don't like him. I'm sure some people do. Same the world over. Tell me something about the process of writing. When do you write? How do you write? Is it a daily discipline? Is it something you do in bursts? Do you write for a bit and then not write? How does it work?
So it is a daily discipline, but I noticed when people ask me about writing, usually what they have in mind as writing is what I call writing the first draft. So if
Mm.
they ask, do you write every day and so on? And I recently made a calculation, and I think only between 15 to 20% of my time is dedicated to first drafts.
Mm.
A lot of it is planning, lots and lots of planning. And sometimes it's hard to see this as work. If I, walk about campus and think about what I'm going to write, it seems like, oh, I didn't do anything today. So
Yeah.
I remind myself that this is an essential part of work. Lots and lots of rewriting and revising and editing and so on and so on. So
Mm.
I write every day, but it's not always, writing from scratch, something that, new words.
And in terms
And
of your characters, are they planned in detail? Would you have a sort of like an advertising persona? Would you create a document with all the foibles about the person?
somehow my brain doesn't work like that.
Right.
I seem to be more plot oriented. So
Yeah.
usually I have a plot line, and then when I have it, I think, what kind of character would work best there? So I have a novel in Hebrew, Alma Kazan, Lady of Kazan, and it's about a single woman who goes to adopt a child in Russia.
Mm.
And I really wanted to write about that. And then I thought, okay, who would work best there? And of course, it's someone who, a little arrogant, a little, not someone who is rolling along with the punches, someone who is always, a difficult character. That's how I work. Mm.
Interesting. Interesting. So, is more coming in English? Are we going to see more Maya Arad on our bookshelves in the UK and in America?
So hopefully, yes, there is a one novel that Jessica Cohen just finished translating, and it will come out in English in August this year. The Hebrew title is Shanim Tovot, and in English, it's going to be called Happy New Years. And it's an epistolary novel spanning over 50 years. It's a young Israeli woman going to teach Hebrew in America in the late 1960s. And every year in Rosh Hashanah, she's writing a letter back home to her friends from the Teachers College, telling them what happened over the past year. So 50 letters every year. And the trick is not so much the letters themselves, but reading between the lines to see, what was really going on there.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I, for one, will look forward to reading that. I'm sure many of our audience will too. Maya, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. Maya's book is available on Amazon and in other good bookshops. And to say thank you, I'm going to send you a book of some of my photographs. These are Faces of Israel, which I'm sure you will find interesting. Now, a few words about our upcoming programme before we leave you. On the 17th of March, we've got Keith Kahn-Harris. He's making a welcome return to Milim to tell us about his new book, Everyday Jews, Why the Jewish People Are Not Who You Think They Are. We have a lot more in the pipeline. Please visit our website at milim.org.uk for more details. All of these online events are free, but you can, if you wish, make a donation to help with our costs. You'll find a link in the chat now. It's also on our website. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Maya Arad, once again. Thank you so much, Maya. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And looking forward to seeing you all again next time. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.
Thank you.